Sarah and Mark,
What's
animal
happening?
rescue volunteers,
Are they
received
okay?
a call about a
I'm
lump of
checking
fur
now.
near
Looks
some
like they're
dumpsters.
coordinating the response.
The dog was in terrible condition, matted fur, malnourished, and terrified of humans. They discovered a severely traumatized dog, later named Benji, hiding in an alley. 6 months later, Benji transformed into a happy, healthy dog with a beautiful brown coat, playing with Gus and showing affection to his new family. Let's go back to the story from the beginning. He was a ghost, a whisper of a dog, completely swallowed by the noise of the city. From a distance, you wouldn't even know what he was, maybe a pile of discarded rags. A forgotten piece of urban decay, left to be consumed by the grit and grime. But if you looked closer, if you dared to let your eyes adjust to the deep shadows of the alley he called home, you might see the faintest rise and fall. A single breath, it was the only sign that life was still stubbornly clinging to this broken little body. Covered in matted fur that had become a painful, suffocating cage, and wearing scars that told stories he could never speak, he hid from the world. Every clang of metal, every distant siren, every footstep that came to close it was all a fresh wave of terror that forced him deeper into the darkness. He'd become a master of being invisible, a creature who wasn't defined by what he was, but by what he wasn't, not seen, not heard, not touched. The memory of a gentle hand or the comfort of a full belly. These were ideas from a world that wasn't his anymore, or maybe never was. His life was just a cycle of fear, hunger, and pain, a constant ache in his body and his soul. Curled into a tight ball of misery, he had surrendered and was simply waiting for the end. He had given up hope, but hope hadn't given up on him. Compassionate strangers, guided by a flicker of empathy in a world that had shown him none, were about to find him. They were about to look into the darkness and see not a problem, but a life worth saving. His story wasn't over. In fact, it was just about to begin. The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon. It was vague, the kind of call that could mean anything or nothing. A resident in an industrial park on the edge of town had reported seeing a lump of fur near a row of dumpsters. They said it had been there for a few days, maybe more. They weren't sure if it was even alive. For Sarah and Mark, who dedicated their free time to a local animal rescue, these were the calls that made up their world. Calls that often led to heartbreak, but sometimes they led to miracles. They drove their worn-out SUV into the maze of cracked pavement and windowless warehouses. The air here smelled different, a metallic tang of rust mixed with the damp scent of neglect. It was a place where things and creatures were left to be forgotten. They parked the car and got out. The quiet was only broken by the hum of a distant electrical transformer and the skittering of unseen things. The call said by the blue dumpsters, Mark said, his voice low, a habit from years of not wanting to scare an already terrified animal. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the area, a familiar knot of dread tightening in her stomach. They walked the length of the grim, graffiti-tagged wall, peering into the shadows cast by the hulking metal bins. At first, nothing, just overflowing garbage and broken pallets. They checked behind the first dumpster, then the second, still nothing. For a moment, they thought it was another false alarm. Then, as they rounded the third and final dumpster, Sarah stopped. She put a hand on Mark's arm, her signal for absolute silence. There, huddled against the cold concrete, tucked so far back he was almost part of the shadows, was a small, trembling shape. He was the color of dust and dried mud, perfectly camouflaged. He wasn't a lump of fur. He was a dog, barely. As they took a cautious step closer, a sound came from the shape, low and guttural. It was a growl, but not an aggressive one. It was the sound of pure terror. It was the only defense he had left. His body seemed to shrink even further, flattening to the damp ground as if he could will himself to just melt away. They could see the matted clumps of his coat, twisted into thick ropes that had to be pulling at his skin. Underneath that foul armor, his frame was skeletal. He was alive, but only just, and he was utterly terrified of them. Getting close would be impossible. Touching him seemed unthinkable. They exchanged a silent look, a conversation they'd had 100 times before. This wasn't going to be a simple rescue, this was going to be a siege of compassion. Force was never an option. Cornering him or using a catchpole would shatter what little spirit he had left. They knew that with a dog this traumatized, the first step wasn't capture, it was communication. They had to prove they weren't a threat, and that lesson had to be taught on his terms, at his pace. This would become their daily ritual. On the first day, they set the routine. They arrived at the same time, just as the sun began to dip. They spoke to each other in calm, gentle tones, never looking directly at him. Mark opened a can of the smelliest, meatiest dog food they had, letting the scent do the talking. Sarah filled a clean bowl with fresh water. They placed both bowls about 20 feet from his hiding spot, a distance they hoped felt safe, and then they backed away. They sat in their car, engine off, and waited. An hour passed. He didn't move. They drove away with heavy hearts, but when they returned after dark, both bowls were licked clean. It was a start. For the next 3 days, the pattern held. They'd arrive, place the food, and retreat. He'd only eat after they were gone, using the darkness as a shield. But something was changing. When they arrived, he no longer growled. Instead, a small, filthy head would peer out from behind the dumpster, his eyes locked on them, studying their every move. On the 5th day, they pushed the boundary a tiny bit, moving the bowl a single foot closer. Then another foot. The next day, he was still waiting for them to leave, but he was learning the choreography of their kindness. Sarah even started a new tradition. She'd sit on the ground, a safe distance away, and read out loud from a paperback. Her voice became part of the scenery, a steady, calm sound that wasn't aimed at him, but simply existed in his space. He would listen, his head cocked, body still tense, but his eyes held a flicker of something other than fear. It almost looked like curiosity. The first real breakthrough came on day 11. A cold rain was falling, turning the alley into a slick of mud and misery. They brought the usual meal, plus a thick, fleece blanket. They placed it near the food, an offering of warmth, but he ignored it completely. Their hearts sank. Then, Mark had an idea. He went back to the car and returned with Gus, their unflappable, gentle-souled golden retriever. Gus was their secret weapon, a furry diplomat who spoke the language of calm. Mark had Gus lie down about 15 feet from the dumpster. Gus, ever the good boy, promptly put his head on his paws and sighed. The little stray watched this with an intensity they hadn't seen before. He saw another dog relaxed and safe around these strange giants. It was a piece of information that seemed to finally compute. They are a threat to all of us. The true turning point, the moment the siege was won, arrived on day 20. For nearly 3 weeks, they had come, offered food and gentle voices, and asked for nothing. Today, when they placed the food down, something was different. The hesitation that kept him glued to his spot seemed to fade. They sat by their car as usual, and then it happened. He took a single, hesitant step out from behind the dumpster. Then another. He moved low to the ground, his eyes darting between the food and the 2 humans watching him. He reached the bowl and began to eat quickly, desperately, but he didn't retreat. He ate right there, in the open, acknowledging their presence. A silent truce had been declared. He was telling them he was ready. He was ready, but that didn't mean it would be easy. His trust was a fragile seedling, and the act of capture, no matter how gentle, would feel like a storm. But they couldn't leave him in the alley. A cold snap was coming, a reminder that his health couldn't withstand the winter. It was time. Their plan was built around the routine he trusted. Instead of just a bowl, they brought a large travel crate. They propped the door open so it felt less like a trap and more like a strange new dining room. Inside, they placed his best meal yet, warm chicken and gravy. For 2 days, he cautiously sniffed the crate, but hunger and the trust they'd built won out. He'd step inside, eat, and leave. The crate became part of the ritual. On the 3rd day, it was time. They had tied a long, thin rope to the crate door. Sarah held the other end, hiding behind the open door of their SUV. Mark placed the food inside, murmuring his usual quiet greetings. It's okay, buddy. It's time to go home. As Benji, the name they'd given him, stepped inside the crate, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. He was focused on the food, his guard down. With a deep breath, she gently pulled the rope. The crate door swung shut, and the latch clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo through the alley. Panic! The quiet creature exploded into a thrashing whirlwind of terror. He slammed his frail body against the sides of the crate, snarling and barking with a ferocity they didn't know he had. It was a raw, desperate fight for a freedom he thought he'd just lost forever. It was heartbreaking to watch. Sarah and Mark fought the urge to rush forward. They stayed back, giving him space, speaking to him in a continuous, calm current. It's okay, Benji. You're safe now. Shh, you're okay. The worst is over. After a few long minutes, the thrashing stopped, replaced by heavy, ragged panting. He retreated to the back of the crate, his body trembling, his eyes wide with a look of profound betrayal. The gentle giants had become his captors. Slowly, they approached, and Mark lifted the crate as smoothly as possible, carrying their precious, terrified cargo to the car. The ride to the vet was silent. Benji didn't make a sound. He was a frozen statue of fear. Sarah sat in the back beside the crate, her fingers resting on the wire mesh, talking to him the entire way. She told him he was a good boy. She told him he was going to get help. She told him he'd never be cold or hungry again. She was making promises she was determined to keep, trying to bridge the gap between his terror and their intent. They had saved him, but the even harder work was just beginning, saving him from his own fear. The Idaho Humane Society Emergency Vet Clinic was ready for them. Mark had called ahead, so a team was waiting. They carried the crate into a private exam room, but for Benji, any new space was a chamber of horrors. When the vet tech opened the crate, Benji pressed himself into the farthest corner, growling. A normal exam was out of the question. The head vet, Dr. Evans, made the call quickly. We need to sedate him. It's the kindest and safest way to see what we're dealing with. As the drugs took hold, Benji's trembling body finally went still. For the first time since they found him, he was at peace, even if it was artificial. With Benji unconscious, the true extent of his neglect was laid bare. A groomer began the painstaking task of shaving away the matted fur. It was more like shearing a sheep with a shell of hardened filth. The clippers struggled through the dense mess, and the smell was overwhelming. The entire coat came off in one single, horrifying piece. It was heavy like a wet blanket and weighed nearly 5 pounds. 5 pounds of pain and neglect he had carried every single day. What lay beneath was shocking, even for the seasoned staff. His skin was a patchwork of angry red inflammation and weeping sores. Parasites crawled over his raw skin. He was a skeleton draped in skin, his ribs and spine starkly visible. His paws were swollen and his nails had curled back into his pads. The exam also revealed cracked and infected teeth, a source of constant, agonizing pain. Dr. Evans gave Sarah and Mark the diagnosis. Physically, we can fix most of this. We'll get him on antibiotics, fluids, and a careful refeeding plan. We'll deal with the teeth once he's stronger. But she said, her eyes meeting theirs, the psychological trauma is profound. That's the mountain you'll really need to climb. His body is healing, but his spirit is deeply wounded. That night, Benji was tucked into a warm, quiet kennel in the clinic's recovery ward. He had a soft bed and a heated blanket. When he woke up, he was groggy and confused, but for the first time in what could have been years, he wasn't in constant pain from his skin being pulled. He wasn't cold, he wasn't in danger. He still huddled in the corner of the kennel, a small, naked, and vulnerable creature, but he was safe. A quiet kennel, a clean blanket, a full bowl of food, simple things. But for a dog who had known nothing but hardship, it was the beginning of an entirely new world. There was no question about what would happen next. Benji couldn't go to a noisy, stressful shelter. Sarah and Mark knew his recovery depended on quiet and consistency. They felt a profound connection to this broken soul and decided to foster him themselves. Bringing him home was like bringing a wild animal into the house. He walked on tentative paws, his body low to the ground, immediately finding the quietest room and wedging himself behind a desk. That corner became his world. For the first week, he barely moved. He would only eat when he was absolutely alone, flinching at every normal sound: the microwave, the furnace, the TV. He refused to make eye contact, believing that to be seen was to be in danger. Once again, their calm golden retriever, Gus, became a key part of the healing. Gus seemed to understand that the new arrival was fragile. He didn't approach Benji. Instead, he simply existed, providing a living model of what a relaxed, safe dog looked like. Benji's life in the corner became a study of Gus. He watched with intense focus as Gus greeted Sarah and Mark with a wildly wagging tail. He watched Gus roll over for belly rubs, a display of ultimate trust. He watched Gus chase a squeaky toy, a picture of pure joy. Every action was a lesson, a piece of a puzzle Benji was slowly putting together. The milestones, when they came, were tiny, but to Sarah and Mark, they were huge. After 2 long weeks, Benji crept out from his office sanctuary and lay down just inside the living room doorway, a silent observer of family life. He was choosing to be near them. A week later, Sarah was sitting on the floor reading when Benji stood up, walked slowly across the room, and sniffed her outstretched hand for a single, breathtaking second. Then he retreated. He had initiated contact. He had asked a question: "Are you safe?" But the most emotional breakthrough was the tail wag. It was the end of the 3rd week. Mark came home and greeted Gus with his usual happy pats. From the hallway, Benji watched, and then it happened. A single, hesitant, almost questioning flick of his tail. It wasn't a happy wag, not yet, but it was a sign that the ice around his heart was starting to thaw. They tried to introduce him to the idea of play. Mark gently rolled a soft ball in his direction. Benji just stared at it, completely baffled. He had never been taught the language of fun. A few days later, they tried again. This time, Gus nudged the ball with his nose, then looked at Benji. Mimicking the action, Benji tentatively touched the ball with his own nose. He didn't play, but he engaged. He was learning, one slow step at a time. He was unfurling. The tight, terrified knot of a dog was slowly, cautiously beginning to open up. CTA called to action Benji's incredible journey from a ghost in an alley to a dog learning to love is a powerful testament to the spirit of rescue. This kind of transformation is only possible because of the unwavering patience of volunteers like Sarah and Mark and the resources of rescue organizations that refuse to give up. Every day, stories like Benji's are waiting to happen, but they depend entirely on the compassion of people like you. The cost of medical care and rehabilitation for a severely neglected dog can be immense. If Benji's story moved you, please consider supporting your local animal rescue or shelter. A small donation can help buy the food that coaxes a terrified dog out of hiding. Offering to foster can provide the quiet space a traumatized animal needs to heal. Even just liking and sharing this video helps raise awareness and can inspire someone else to open their heart. Please subscribe to our channel to follow more of these amazing transformations, and click the link in the description to find out how you can be a part of the next happy ending. 6 months after that day in the alley, you wouldn't recognize him. The change was more than just physical, it was a transformation from the inside out. The once naked, scarred body was now covered in a coat of soft, chocolate brown fur. The emaciated frame had filled out, but the real change was in his eyes. The haunted, terrified stare was gone. In its place was a soft, soulful gaze, full of warmth and trust. The dog who didn't know how to play now spent his afternoons joyfully running in a grassy backyard, chasing his best friend, Gus. He'd bound across the lawn, ears flapping, a picture of pure freedom. The dog who flinched at every sound now initiated cuddles. He'd hop onto the couch in the evening and press his body against Sarah, resting his head on her lap with a sigh of contentment. He had found his voice, not the terrified growl of the alley, but a happy, Excited bark he let out whenever Mark came home. He was no longer a ghost defined by fear. He was Benji, a happy, confident, and deeply loved member of a family. He was, finally, home. He was terrified and alone, a creature so broken by the world that he had tried to become invisible. He'd built a fortress of fear around his heart and resigned himself to a life of silent suffering. But they found him in the darkness of that alley. They didn't see a lost cause. They saw the beautiful dog he could be. With a patience that felt infinite, they showed him that a human hand could offer comfort, not just pain, and that a voice could soothe, not just threaten. They didn't just save his life, they gave him one, piece by patient piece, until he was whole again.